Welcome to the Sharp Way Show. I'm so happy to have you here this evening. And we are talking today. I mean, you're probably saying, wait a minute, Larry, another show at 7 p.m.? Yes, I'm here again at 7 p.m. I know you missed me, but I am here yet again. And today's show is going to be about something interesting for many of you who have been watching me for a long time. We're talking today a little bit about things like socialism and versus capitalism and even Marxism and all the cool isms of the day, and how we can maybe solve some problems and what's happening in America and across the world. And I brought in today someone who I think can give us some serious insight into this. He is both an author and a professor, recently been on all types of shows all over the place. The man himself, Daniel Bessner. How are you?
Good, Larry. Thanks for having me.
Of course, absolutely. And for those of you who want to see what he's doing, you can check him out at AmericanPrestigePod.com, or just follow him on Twitter if you want to. And that's at D Bessner. And if you're listening to the podcast, that's Bessner, D Bessner. So I have to ask you, Daniel, the piece that I hear often from others and you is that America is on the decline. And I've heard many people say this. I'm not sure you believe this, but I've heard many people say the reason why America's on the decline, a big reason, I mean, it's many, but it's because of capitalism. Where do you stand on that?
Sure. I think there's a couple of different ways to view it. And let's take it just internationally and from the global scale, at least to start, and we could go from there. So if you look back at World War II, the United States decided for various reasons to become the global hegemon, or what it euphemistically refers to as the global leader, to initiate something called the American century. The American century, I would say, had two parts. One, ideological or ideational, about ideas, about the notion that American democracy or American liberalism would be great for the world, and other more material, which is the notion that the United States should have hundreds of military bases around the world, and that the American dollar should be the world's reserve currency. So in 2023, I think the latter is still pretty much in existing. The United States is the global military hegemon. It is the prime military and economic power. The dollar still is the global reserve currency and looks likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. So from that sense, the United States is not in decline. But if you think about ideologically or ideationally, I think that we're entering a post-ideological age. I don't think many people believe in American liberalism. I don't think many people around the world think that American-style capitalism is going to lift them up from wherever they may be. So I think the ideological and ideational elements of the American century
I want to touch that piece. Why do you think that when still so many people are rushing to the country? I feel like people are rushing it because they do believe that this is still right for them. Am I wrong? Tell me. I'm happy to be wrong here.
No. Well, when you're talking about these large macro questions, it's kind of how you see it. I think the United States has placed itself at the top of a global capitalist system. So would you rather be at the top of the system, or would you rather be at the bottom of the system? If you're in a developing world country, if you're in the global South, of course, you'd rather be in the United States than in a place like China or Russia. But does that mean that people believe in the sort of light unto the world, the city on a hill logic that really did form a coherent part of the project of the American century? I don't really think that is necessarily the case. And if they do believe it, I would say that if you look at what has been produced domestically, that is just not available. There's been increasing inequality. There's been increasing social enemy. There's been increasing social ennui. So the fact that people come here doesn't really mean much.
But you said believe. Now, I don't know if that's true. I mean, I think many Americans who are in America now would agree with you and say it's not going well. I think that's true. But I still think an ideological piece, I mean, if you look at countries like Germany and Sweden and even countries like that are doing relatively well compared to the global South, we're still getting people coming to us compared to reverse, right? More people are coming from Sweden to America than are going from America to Sweden. Don't you think people still
what are
have
the relative
that feeling in their head still?
I would have to actually, you wouldn't take Sweden, you would take the EU.
Okay.
And you would have to actually look at migration. I can't really give an answer because if a lot of people from Latin America are coming to the US versus a lot of people from North Africa and the Middle East and Southwest Asia are going to Europe, that's how I imagine it would break down. It would be mostly geographically. So I can't really answer. You know, if you're in Mexico, you're going to come to the US. If you're in Algeria, you're going to go to Europe. So we would have to look at those numbers to have a real answer to that.
But what I'm saying is, if you look at EU, Americans going to the EU versus EU citizens, if you want to call them citizens, I don't know what they call themselves.
When you're talking about the North Atlantic world, I mean, you'd rather live. The North Atlantic world, there's levels of consumption that are equivalent enough, then you wouldn't necessarily leave your culture to go from, let's say, the United States to Sweden or from Germany to Florida. I think it does seem to have been a sort of level of consumption reached in the global North that prevents those sorts of migration outflows. If you look at throughout history, why do people like leave, deracinate themselves, which is an enormously difficult thing to do, to leave one's home? It's a pretty extreme choice. And I think now in the era of cheap calories and cheap entertainment, there's just less impetus for those sorts of massive life changes than there are in other parts of the world. So you see what I'm saying?
I guess, I don't know. I'm struggling to be forward. I'm not saying you're wrong and that America is no longer the place where people can move up fast, right? I think that the data is in. There are other countries that actually you're able to move up faster. There's other countries that have less, wealth inequality. I think that's obviously true. I was talking just on still the image of the world, that if you look at immigration from the EU to US and US to the EU, I do know this, more come from the EU to America than America to the EU. And that's
we'd have to look at industries. My guess is that has to do with particular industries and which industries are centered in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. To me, that's not like a huge social concern, the amount of immigration to go to tech or whatever it may be. My guess is it's that form of high-skilled immigration would be my guess.
Okay, I got you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please.
No, please interrupt. No, that's it. I'm done.
So, with that in mind, if America is, started the century of America, which I agree with you, I think the biggest issue why America had its century, it seems to me, is that the rest of the world was bombed.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
It's pretty easy to be number one when everyone else is bombed, right?
In 1945, the statistic I like to give, in 1945, the U.S. was responsible for, I think, 50% of world exports. So, I mean, that's just never going to happen again. As I wrote a piece for Harper's Magazine last summer that talks about this in depth, this sort of material reasons that sort of domination is not going to happen anytime soon.
So, all right. But why do you believe, others, maybe you don't, but I've heard a million times, I live in New York City, the reason why America is failing is because capitalism. The reason why we're failing now is all because capitalism. This part I have trouble accepting that as the reason why America's failing, or the reason why there's a wealth gap is because capitalism. I keep hearing that, and do you believe that? Am I wrong, or are they wrong today? I don't think that's true. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, I wouldn't use the term failing necessarily, but here, I just have a quick question. Do you think capitalism, by definition, basically necessitates growth to exist? Could you have a non-growth capitalism? No, right? Kind of not.
No, no, I think people would suffer far worse.
Okay, yes. So that means we're killing the planet by definition under capitalism. How do you respond to that?
I think you've just made that up. That's not definitely true. How do you know?
You don't think that consumption, the consumptive resources unleashed by the Industrial Revolution are resulting in climate change that are inherent to capitalism, that necessitate constant growth, constant expansion, that are basically going to cook the planet?
I would say no to all of that, and I'll explain why. The first thing I would say is, just because you're growing doesn't necessarily mean you're actually using more resources. For example, you could shift to different types of energy. You could shift to solar energy. You could shift to
Does the profit motive incentivize that?
Absolutely it does. It's government interference that does not.
Which is why we have so many solar panel companies and wind companies. I just don't think that's borne out by empirics. And if you look at when actually the United States has made enormous leaps in technological advances, it's always been due to sustained government investment. I just think that's an empirical fact that the 20th century history shows. I just don't see how one could argue that the free market will lead to those sorts of socially positive outcomes. There's no historical evidence for that.
I would argue the existence of 8.5 billion people on a planet would prove you wrong.
Well, that's talking about the Green Revolution.
That we could have 8.5 billion people on the planet if it wasn't for technological advances that came forward. And I would argue the number one
that's the Green Revolution
when it comes to energy. Hold on 1 second. The number one advance for energy, I believe, it would have been nuclear energy. And nuclear energy has been stifled by governments everywhere.
Okay, so I would say if you're looking at, you're basically talking about like caloric intake as a result of the Green Revolution. A lot of that, again, I'm not an expert on it, but a lot of that, from my understanding of the history, was directed by government investment. If you're talking about nuclear energy, I would agree. Again, I'm not an expert, but it does seem like nuclear energy is cleaner than things like coal. And then we get into the problem of government capture and capitalism, where certain interests and lobbyists basically capture certain segments of the government because capital is in many instances, not all, but in many instances more powerful than the state. So again, I don't quite see how that's the government.
Sure, I can tell you how. Because the government has so much power to control the industries that it makes sense for the industries to control the government. So if the government didn't control as much as the industries, then you would find less of that. And my example would be two industries that are directly next to each other, which is medical industry for essential care and medical industry for non-essential care. Things like cosmetic surgery, LASIK eye surgery, cosmetic dentistry, body enhancements, that type of thing. If you look at the one run by government, heavily monopolized, the government decides, certificates of need, it keeps getting more expensive. Insurance companies go out of their way to control the government, to write regulations, bad, bad, and bad. But now you look at the one that's right next to it, which is just as dangerous. People could die when they're doing enhancements or LASIK eye surgery, whatever. In every single case, price has gone down, accessibility has gone up, and safety is the same, if not better. And it's less regulated and less controlled by the government. It's basically the private market.
But I would say your framing is wrong, because in the former market, that's capitalism. Basically, you're sorry, in the first market you're talking about, where the quote unquote government controls it. I mean, it's a government under capitalism, so you cannot separate these.
Under capitalism,
right? There's no such thing as a free market. This is the classic business historian's argument across the political spectrum, where there's no such thing as a free market because the government is always variously at various points in the system making rules. So empirically, that thing doesn't exist. So when you're talking about the government controls, I would say sure, but you're leaving out the government controls in a capitalist system where you have government executives going to the insurance companies. You have lobbying, which is legal, which is basically legalized capitalism. So I would say in the actually empiric history that exists in the world, free markets are an impossibility. So the idealist utopia you're talking about can never actually be realized.
Hold on, no. Two things. One, I'm not talking utopia. I'm talking about in the world right now, right? In the world right now, LASIK eye surgery versus having cancer, right? Whatever the case may be. That's what, not
a small elective luxury. It's basically the difference between a luxury and a mass good. And so this is, I mean, you could see this. It's also easier to, what would be a good example? Probably some sort of form of vacation or something along those lines, or business class or whatever it may be is more efficient, right? Because these are luxury goods that are basically marketed to a small segment of the population that function more efficiently because the rich get access to things that are better. The problem is, what do you do in a mass society like our own, or at least a theoretically mass society like our own? To me, you're comparing apples and oranges effectively, right? LASIK and cancer surgery are not really I mean, they both fall in our political economy under the broad rubric of medical, but they're very, very different by definition.
Well, then how
One
about something
cannot
that
be.
isn't so harsh, like
Are you suggesting private corporations now? Well, they already are. But this is the problem. So you think it would be better for 40 private corporations to be behind anti-cancer medication than the government pooling all of its resources to have a quote unquote war on cancer, as opposed to the actual war on cancer initiated by Richard Nixon, which basically was a wealth transfer from the government to private corporations and hasn't solved cancer?
Yes. That's literally what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I just think there's no
literally
historical
proved my
evidence.
point. Once you look, the reality of it is there's also no such thing as pure communism or pure socialism or pure Marxism, right?
Well,
There's
the government
always
is just
going to be some type of interference by some bullying factor, right?
Let's get a little political theory. So there's
Please.
a very interesting political theorist called David Ciepley, or Ciepley. I forget how you pronounce his name. So he is actually going into the origins of the modern corporation and the modern state. And they essentially emerge from the same Enlightenment philosophy. Like the idea of the corporation and the idea of the state are fundamentally the same. The only difference is that the state is theoretically subject to democratic control. The problem in this country is that we have created a state, and I would say throughout the world, that is not subject to democratic control. So we have a form of anti-democratic liberalism, which under capitalism is going to enrich the few at the expense of the many. So it's not the government that's the problem. It's the particular form of anti-democratic liberal government that has actually developed, because the government is really just a corporation. Literally in its political theory, it is just a corporation. It is a corporate body that does things. The idea is that it's different from, let's say, Microsoft because it's democratically accountable. The problem is we don't have a system that's democratically accountable. I'm sorry?
And it's a monopoly.
But we have that in basically every industry now. If you look at Hollywood, if you look at Amazon, these are all, I would say in capitalism, things tend toward monopoly or oligopoly or monopsony, right? In various instances, they tend toward these things. I would say that's inherent in capitalism, which is why you will never have an anti-monopolistic capitalism. It's a contradiction in terms.
But then if you're going to argue
that's what history showed, at least. My
argument is I would rather have a government that's actually democratic, which I agree completely. It's not in America at all. It's heavily because of the system, two-party system, the way the parties work. It is absolutely not democratic at all. I completely agree with you. And that's true. I think if we had more democracy, I think we had a government that would be more focusing on one thing, which is breaking up the monopolies that usually happen in capitalism. And if you don't have so much government control, then there is no reason for the individual governments to try to get regulatory capture. With less regulations run by government and more standards run by industries, I think you have more of a chance of having a better system. And my example of this one is, let me give my example. My example of this one is health food stores and natural food stores. The vast majority of those products in those stores are not FDA approved. Some are, but the vast majority aren't. The vast majority are checked by third-party private institutions. And I would ask you, where are all the addicts out of those stores? None. Where are all the deaths out of those stores? None. Where are all the unhealthy people out of those stores? None. The healthiest people shop in those stores, and those are products that literally go into the bodies of children every day. Yet that is literally safer. The FDA-approved drugs and FDA-approved food have killed far more Americans than every single health food store ever created on the planet.
Totally agree. But both of these things are operating under capitalism from the beginning, a society divided by wage. That's the problem at the beginning. And you keep on referring to luxury industries. And again, it's not a surprise that industries that serve the rich are better than industries that don't serve
health food
the rich.
Stores don't. Have you lived in New York City? Health food stores don't support only the rich.
I would disagree with that. I mean, if you look at the cost of groceries in health food stores, it's just, an empirical fact that they are more expensive. And that the lower you are down the socioeconomic ladder, the less likely you are to shop at health food stores. So again, I agree. Capitalism works well for the rich, which is what you've argued. And I could totally agree. The problem is you have to go back to a first principle of a society basically organized around wage, and really a society organized around people who are not laboring getting the value of labor, which is the society that exists under capitalism, which is the society that we have now.
So maybe we should be thinking that labor, particularly with the way things are going now, AI and robotics and such, that maybe labor isn't as important as we thought it was. Maybe we should be looking, instead of a wage, at things like an income instead. Maybe that's a better way of looking at things.
Well, I mean, this is what you're saying what Karl Marx said. This is Marx's argument, is that capitalism is a stage on the way to somewhere else. The problem is that we've stopped at capitalism, right? He would say that in capitalism, labor is super important. And then if the proletariat seized itself, it would be able to use the fruits of capitalism for, you know, the greater good. The problem is that we just ended at capitalism, and capitalism is doing what capitalism does, which is getting rid of labor to concentrate profits. So you're right. This is what capitalism is going to do. This is what Marx said it would do. But the problem is that Marx's prediction about the proletariat becoming conscious in and of itself and seizing the tools of capitalism for itself has not proven correct. So we have kind of the worst of both worlds, where we have a capitalism, again, doing what capitalism does, getting rid of labor, concentrating profits, but there's no one to actually seize those for the greater good, except, like you said, if you're rich. Life is pretty fucking good under capitalism. I totally agree.
But I would argue that if you were in China or India.
China's a capitalist system.
I know, which is why, and it's better than when it wasn't. That was my point, right? If I was a Chinese
apples and oranges.
If I was a Chinese peasant in 1935, 1945, compared to a Chinese person now, 1995, 2005, 2015, I'm a whole lot happier than I was back then, aren't I?
I mean, yeah, but you have to kind of washing out all the externalities that went into creating that system, the brutality that that form of capitalist development had to undergo. I mean, this is the
communist system wasn't it even worse? I mean, wasn't Chinese communism, according to Mao, if I remember what he said, he's called his system Marxism with Chinese properties? That's correct. Yes, characteristics. Thank you. So it wasn't that far worse?
So to me, I don't think you're locating the problem. I think the real problem was that you have a hyper underdeveloped peasant society in a capitalist industrializing world. That's the problem. Whatever ideology you were going to put on top of that society trying to develop, it was going to be pretty bad. I think that was true of the Soviet Union. That was true of China. I mean, I think the socialists lost when Germany didn't become communist. I think the only chance the socialists had was in the 1910s for the industrial powerhouse of Europe to actually become communist. Once communism basically became promoted by peasant societies, it was never going to succeed without incredible pain, incredible bloodshed. I think we could see that from 2023. Now, was that overdetermined? I don't know. But what happened is that the workers of Europe killed each other instead of uniting to not fight World War I. And I think that was basically communism and socialism was lost at that moment.
So do you think that now there's no chance for that to happen? Because what I've seen happen,
I think we've lost. I think humanity is going to consume more. It's going to grow. It is going to cook the planet. I think in the next 100 years, it's going to mostly happen in the global south. I think in 150 years, it's going to go to the global north, and there's going to be incredible pain and immiseration. I think we lost. I think like we're monkeys. Okay. We lost. Sucks, but we tried.
Well, maybe Elon Musk will take us to Mars and we get a chance to reboot.
It's ridiculous. I mean, that's absolutely absurd. Yeah. No,
maybe.
I would bet my life he does not do that.
Oh, okay. So why can't Elon Musk take us to Mars and we'll reboot the whole thing in Mars? We'll make a new humanity on Mars and reboot.
I just don't think that's how technological development works. I think it's going to be incredibly anti-democratic, and I think it's going to fail. I think it's not going to get buy-in. And suffice to say, Musk and Bezos's rocket companies rely on an incredible amount of government data produced by NACA over the last 100 years. I think we lost. I think we as a species lost.
Okay, I get it. That at least makes sense to me. I get that piece completely. Because my worry is, what I hear from people often is, capitalism is on its way to socialism, right? I hear that all the time. But what I've seen is socialism always winds up being dictatorship. So I feel like we're always on the road to dictatorship, no matter what. We're either ready to go one way or the other.
To me, that's not the function of the socialism or the communism. I mean, you could say that there's a world where there are liberal dictatorships. Think of Singapore, right? True. So, I mean, and there are liberal anti-democratic societies. Think of the United States. To me, that's more, again, as a Marxist, that's more of a function of the level of economic development of the societies where the ideology of communism happened to win in a particular political struggle, as opposed to a function of communism. I think it's totally wrong to say it's a function of communism any more than you could say Singapore dictatorship is a function of liberalism. It's just misdiagnosing what was actually going on, I think.
So then are the socialist ideas that I hear coming out of many people on the left now, particularly those who are unhappy with the Democrats, who think Democrats aren't left enough. When I hear these ideas, you think these are a waste of time, that we don't bother, we're lost, just stick with capitalism, whatever happens, happens?
No,
Is
you
that where your
fight.
head is?
You fight even if you're going to lose. I think you fight on behalf of humanity, leaving a message in the bottle for future generations of a potential human emancipation. So I think you've got to keep on keep on fighting. But when I put on my analyst hat, I just think basically the way that I frame it is that Skynet has become self-aware. So Marx's big prediction, he said, either you're going to get communism or socialism. You've read Marx, right? So either you're going to get communism or socialism, or you're going to get the mutual ruin of the contending classes. I think we're in the era of the mutual ruin of the contending classes. We're going to keep on consuming. We're going to cook the planet. We're going to kill each other.
But didn't we see at one point where the kings and queens and emperors fell, and we had a new group of people who came in? Now we have wealthy oligarchs versus just, hereditary oligarchs, right? So we switched. I mean,
we've increasingly developed a hereditary system, as you are probably well aware, with the Nepo baby discourse and things along those lines. But
yeah, but I mean, just different. It used to be only that, right?
Now it's just mostly that.
Now it's mostly that. Yes, correct.
I mean,
right?
Even back in the day, you would have knights. You would have Charles Martel. Have the Carolingian dynasty. There was even the early and late Middle Ages, there was social mobility to some degree. I think we're kind of re-entering a moment like that. I think there was basically your lifespan, Larry. I don't know quite how old you are, but I think your lifespan was unique, and we're kind of re-entering the historical mean, where it's pretty strict class structure. It's very difficult to move classes, and if you're not born into a particular class, you're pretty much fucked.
But doesn't things like this, the internet, doesn't things like this give the opportunity for someone who's some Joe Schmo to become a heavy hitter? Isn't this equivalent of the kid who's going to become the baseball player or the basketball player, right?
The level of the individual doesn't matter. You have to look at the level of the class and the level of the structure. So there's some random guy who became very successful. And also, if you look at the Zuckerbergs and the Bezoses and the Musk, they already came from money. But let's say Joe Rogan, right? Joe Rogan didn't come from money, right? So yeah, every now and then there's a random multi-20 billionaire or whatever who truly came from the working class. It's the exception rather than the rule. The internet is clearly not a democratizing force of social mobility.
It's not.
It is not. No, clearly not.
Why is it clearly not? Don't I now, having internet, don't I now have the ability to learn virtually anything? Don't I have the ability now that I didn't have 20, 30 years ago?
What's that have to do with social mobility?
Because now I can learn to do something so I can make more money, right? Can't I do that now?
But what has actually happened is that this has led to a decrease in real wages over the last 30 years for everyone living in this country. There's just no connection between the internet and the rise in income or rise in wages. If the opposite has happened.
So you think with the
as an empirical fact, it doesn't. Even though there might be random mega successes.
So you're saying that with the rise of the internet, that since the rise, I would say what, the 90s, 2000s, is that about when you would say internet was rising, 2000s?
Yeah.
You would say with that average income has actually gone down?
So we could even take an empirical example of let's say Hollywood. Hollywood has completely been hollowed out by the rise of the internet and the advent of a direct consumer market. Let's take stores. Amazon has completely destroyed the sort of middle class of stores that have existed across this country. Let's take music. Amazon has completely not Amazon's, my apologies. The internet has completely destroyed the entire music industry. Let's take video stores, don't exist. Bookstores don't exist. It's just been actually a very destructive force. And again, in an anti-democratic capitalist society, there's not going to be there's not going to be a government to effectively staunch those losses. So you're just going to have increase in income inequality and wealth inequality.
Let me touch a couple of those that you brought up. If you were to ask the average person in the music industry, has the internet hurt them or helped them? I would bet most would say help. And the reason why I would say
that's not true. I know people in the music. This is a personal family thing. That's not true. And actually, I think Spin magazine, I think 10 years ago, did like a really interesting feature where they would compare the music industry in 2015 to where it was in 1980, the 80s and I mean, it just doesn't exist as a career anymore. And you're seeing it right now with the WGA strike. Basically, they're trying to gigify the rest of the taxis. Every fucking industry has actually been eroded. So no, I think actually everyone would disagree with you as an empirical matter. Music industry has definitely gotten worse. So people aren't able to make money.
If you go back to the 1980s, right, and you're a band, how do you grow your band if you don't get signed to a label?
I'm actually doing a podcast on this. I could really get into the details, but suffice it to say, there was more. So what you would do is you would essentially associate with an indie record label. You would travel around the country. You would, over several years, build up a fan base. That fan base would actually provide enough through record sales to live a middle-class lifestyle. So you were able to have actually more bands that were able to live a middle-class lifestyle. Now, because there is no money in selling records, because people basically all have, Spotify has everything and people get pennies on the dollar, the only way to actually make money is to sell merchandise at huge concerts. The problem is the only people who succeed in that are large rock bands. So now, like the rest of the economy, you have huge rock bands like Pearl Jam or the Rolling Stones, and basically a decline of indie rock bands as well. You have 1 million kids making records in their basements and uploading it to the internet, but no one's listening because there's no actual social infrastructure to serve a function of getting these bands out there, people deciding who is good, who is bad. So it's actually much, much, much more difficult to make a middle-class living as an artist today. You're either Taylor Swift or you're not a musician.
Wow. Okay. That sounds terrible.
Yeah, it is terrible. And I'm funny. I'm literally working on a podcast about the history of the Seattle rock scene now. And it's just everyone says is like you were able to live a life as a band, and that is not possible anymore. Partially due to the internet.
Speaking of that, let me do some admin. Guys, if you want to hear what Daniel was talking about, you can head over to his website if you want to, AmericanPrestigePod.com, or follow him on Twitter at DBessner. And if you're listening to the podcast, BESSNER. Also, if you like what you're hearing, do me a favor, click that like button. How am I going to get past Mr. Algorithm if you don't click that like button? I have to. They like stopping me and doing that kind of stuff. So help me out. Click the like button. You should do that. And also, if you're watching this on Twitter, then please retweet this as we speak. Stop looking at me. Hit the retweet button. That's what matters. Do that now. If you want your chat to get to the front, you can always super chat me if you're watching on YouTube. I'm happy to bring that right to the front. So I guess I feel like there's some doom and gloom coming out of you, Daniel. A lot of doom and gloom. So if that's the case, why wouldn't we want to, I guess, embrace the gig economy and embrace ownership of things? And why would we try to embrace that more and get more people to, I guess a Marx idea, which is to own the means of production, have more co-ops, things like that, versus having government step in and
because we live under capitalism. It's not going to work in the capitalist system that we actually have, where everyone's an individual entrepreneur. The stakes are just totally aligned against them. In a different world, sure, with various guarantees and various regulations, but in the actually existing world, as I'm sure you know, who benefits, the corporation or labor? The deck is stacked totally against labor. So if you want a society,
what if the laborers own the corporation? Don't they then benefit?
Sure. Like if everyone's King Arthur Flower or whatever it is in Vermont, but who actually owns a corporation? It's shareholders. What we actually have is shareholder capitalism. What we actually have is what's happening in Hollywood right now, where people effectively destroyed the entire industry of TV writing because they were able to make short-term profits for the next quarter. That's the actually existing system that we have. So in that system, individual entrepreneurship is going to amount to a hill of beans, and you're just basically going to get fucked.
So couldn't we then shift the system, right? Couldn't we do something like, and I'm just pulling up some ideas because I truly don't want to feel like the world's ending. So I'm going to try to give you pushback on the ending world thing. What if we were to instead change how we do our stock market as an example, right? One of the things that I find in America that's a big problem is our push on finance. Everything is freaking finance, right? so many companies that make things don't make any money on the thing they make money on financing things, right? Even though they're making a thing, right? They sell cups, but they don't make any money on selling cups. They make money on financing cups, so money on financing people who make cups or whatever. What if we were to change those rules, where that financing is shifted to where people had to actually make things again, that kind of thing? Maybe taking the stock market, and it's not run by an SEC, it's run by a gaming commission because it's gambling anyway. So now a gaming commission runs the stock market. Things like that, those types of changes, are they valuable or no?
Sure, they're not going to happen, but sure, I think the last 30 years have demonstrated that capitalist liberalism, absent a major threat from the Soviet Union or an ideological challenger, or at the very least a perceived ideological challenger, because frankly, I think the Soviet Union never had a chance to combat the United States empirically. It tends toward its worst impulses. It gets rid of the welfare state. It totally deregulates every industry. It financializes the economy. It enriches the few at the expense of the many. That's just what happens. So in your world is assuming a movement of some sort, whether a movement of workers or someone else that is able to move the levers of power. I just don't see that existing.
And I feel like you've said that before. You kind of feel like revolution is not going to happen, almost impossible, basically. Is that true?
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
So then what happens when the people finally do two things? One, get pissed off, and then two, get that hopeful leader who's going to be the one, the Lenin or the Hitler or the whomever.
If you look at those, if you look at those societies, it's a different political moment, right? The military wasn't what it was. There was something called the masses who are able to be politically mobilized. This is what my scholarly work focuses on. The last 70 years throughout the North Atlantic world, what the elites have essentially done is created a state and a military that is effectively unchallengeable. So those conditions for revolution I don't think are realizable. And moreover, when you look at like the Russian Revolution or the 1919 German revolutions, that was oftentimes happening in food scarcity. So what has capital given us? It's given us cheap calories in the form of shit food at McDonald's and porn. And I think my prediction is you're going to see vices be increasingly legalized in the next 10, 15 years. As things feel shittier and shittier, you're going to get, I think, sex work might be legalized. Opiates might be legalized. You see fentanyl, right? Legalization of fentanyl.
This does not sound like a bad thing to me, but yes.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this is more of a philosophical than a political point, but I just don't think people are going.
Did I lose you?
I'm back.
Okay, there we go.
Sorry.
Okay.
So I just don't think, to repeat, I just don't think people are going to realize their full potential when they're narcotized.
Narcotized. I am so stealing that phrase, narcotized. And I probably, to be forward, Daniel, I'm probably going to give you any credit whatsoever. But that's okay. I'm still going to steal that phrase, narcotized. I like that. But with that in mind, right, does that mean at one point the people who are in charge, right, the military industrial complex, the foot soldier, right, the Marine, I was in Marines for many years, right, the Marines, the soldiers, the police force, aren't they also in this? Don't they at one point turn? Doesn't at one point some colonel tell his Marine unit, turn around and say no to the president or whatever?
Doesn't like the Gaddafi, the Gaddafi or the Sadat version. I just don't think that's
Sadat, perfect example of that. Yep.
Yeah, I just don't think that's how the military functions anymore. The military has become professionalized, and the people who basically make the decisions are essentially white collar elites. Not only that, Larry, as you well know, there's no draft. So one of the greatest things that the American capitalists in the military industrial complex has what I termed demassified war, with drones, with military contractors. There is no mass army to do what you're talking about anymore. That was a very conscious decision made in the early 1970s, partially unconsciously, to prevent the types of things you're talking about from happening.
Okay, so with that being the case, if that's true, don't we still have a bunch of, I don't know, good old boys with 300 million guns in America who could say no and
totally
could fight
different.
back like the Afghanis or like the Vietnamese or something.
Nonsense. Americans are not to use the word again, are narcotized. They like to cosplay revolution, but none of these people are dying for anything. This isn't the Germany in the 1920s, where you have a generation of traumatized World War I veterans who have combat experience and who have been are totally nihilistic because they spent 4 years in the trenches. What we have is essentially cosplaying losers who play Call of Duty all day. I'm not exactly worried about them taking over the government, even if they have 500 million guns.
But I feel like in a
way, you'll see, just very quickly, you'll see stochastic violence and mass shootings. That's what you'll see. You're not going to see any revolutionary impulse.
I think we said that already. I think we're already seeing that.
Agreed.
But what about the idea that at one point, I feel like you've said two things. One, that nationalism kind of was the thing that stopped communism. But now I feel like if we had more nationalism, maybe that would stop capitalism. Am I wrong? Am I reading you wrong?
Philosophically, I just don't. I'm a humanist. I think all humans are philosophically equal. Nationalism inherently is a sharp divider between human beings. So philosophically, I'm not a nationalist. The actually existing world of 2023, it seems to me like you would have to work through the nation state in order to get anything done. I'm a Jew. I don't like nationalism. I don't think it's worked out particularly well for the Jews, either historically or the type of extreme nationalism you see in history. True. So no, I will never philosophically endorse nationalism, even if I think you have to work through the nation state.
So let me then go to the nation states. Let's go overseas to Ukraine. You're not a fan of us being in Ukraine.
No, I am not.
But aren't most people that I know, at least, who lean left, they seem to be like, oh my God, we have to be in Ukraine. It's the most important thing in the world. It's saving democracy. I hear they got the flag on their Twitter account. I mean, they're all in, but you lean left, but you're no. Help me understand.
This is the difference between liberalism and the left.
Okay.
But I would say most liberals are in favor of the war. If one is going to be a scholar of political ideology, liberals are not on the left. They are their own thing. They are not a leftist ideology. It's its own thing. And frankly speaking, this might be interesting for listeners. In the United States, we didn't actually use the left-right political spectrum until the 1940s. The left-right political spectrum comes from Europe. On the left are communists, and on the right are monarchists. That in the US, we always thought until the 1940s that our political divisions didn't really make sense. There were progressives, there were populists, there were progressives who were more conservative, there were progressives who were more liberal. There were various instantiations of various political ideologies. In fact, when you, the royal you, use the left-right political spectrum, you're actually buying into what 1940 liberals wanted you to do. 1940s liberals started using the left-right political spectrum in order to identify themselves as the moderate center, with fascism on the right and socialism on the left. And guess who's in the center? Oh my God, it's liberals. So I would just say that people should be aware of that, because these left-right political things don't really map on into the United States, which is why oftentimes our political discussions feel so horrible, because they're not actually reflecting what is going on. So I just wanted to make that point. But I would say from the left that if you look at history, you would have to, and from a left operating within a world of nation states. So there's not an international left talking about what the international left should do. I'm an American citizen. I operate within the United States. I have political voice only in the United States, not in some sort of international left-wing body. So in that empirical world, I think the U.S. empire has done incredible damage to the world since it assumed hegemony in 1945. To me, this is not even a question. Tens of millions of people have been dead and deracinated, made dead and deracinated because of the U.S. empire. So even though today it might feel moral to send weapons to Ukraine, if one's ultimate political project is to reduce the U.S. empire's presence abroad and to reduce the power of the military-industrial complex, every time there's a conflict abroad that liberals find attractive for whatever reason, you can't just send weapons. So to me, it's in service of the longer term goal of attacking the structures of American empire, the structures of the military industrial complex, and the structures of American militarism. But because we live, like I was talking about earlier, to tie it all in, a shareholder capitalism world where people are only thinking about the next quarter and they're not thinking about the medium or long term, everyone just says sends weapons to Ukraine because that's the humane thing to do. I think in the medium and long terms, the humane thing to do, given the history of American empire, is to weaken that empire.
So your view is we should have just let it go and whatever happens, happens.
My view is the United States military should have as its major purpose the defense of the United States. It shouldn't be a globe-spanning empire that, again, empirically has caused an incredible, almost unimaginable amount of death and destruction abroad. So if you take that as your starting position, as I do, the goal, the eye on the prize should be the weakening of that empire. That's my take.
Got it. I'm not going to fight you much on that one. I'm a libertarian, so I'm not going to fight you on that one. Military industrial complex.
Yeah, the minarchist state.
Absolutely. Yes. I do not want us bombing people unless they're literally bombing us. I completely agree 100%. I'm totally with that. And a lot of people who are listening are going to be totally on board with that part, 100%. But there's a lot of people now talking about civil war. I hear it all the time, right? You think that's not real. Well, so what happens to America when we just don't want to live with each other anymore? Assuming that happens, assuming that the divisions keep going and we keep getting angrier at each other, which so far that's happening. How does that round out?
A couple of things. I think you'll see an increase of federalism, again, this time as a left wing as opposed to a right wing project. For most of the 20th century, federalism, devolving power to local authorities was right wing. I think you'll probably see more left wing versions of that. So besides that, I think you'll probably... besides that, you'll probably see a whole lot of nothing, a whole lot of people screaming at each other online before going back to their cheap McDonald's and porn and drugs and legal drugs.
They will be legal drugs at that point. Yes.
Yeah.
Legal drugs.
Or, fentanyl or whatever the latest version of pharmaceuticals are.
So I feel like you're against the idea of us having, the way you speak, you're against the idea of us having ability to have legal drugs, legal porn, legal sex work.
No. I'm in favor of it. I'm in favor of it. I'm pretty much a civil libertarian, but I just think that you can't, see the social function of things like that. I think
am
sex
so
work
proud
should
of myself. I got you to say I'm a social libertarian on this show.
No, civil libertarian. No, there's actually
a libertarian. You just said I win. Life is good.
There's a strong
I'm teasing you. I'm just teasing you.
No, of course. But there's a strong tradition of civil libertarianism on the left. A very, very powerful tradition across the North Atlantic world. Sex work should be legalized.
Yeah.
Most drugs should probably be legalized. The government should have no say, or any authority should have any real say in what goes on in the bedroom. Obviously, above certain limits, like you shouldn't be able to beat the shit out of children or beat up, things like that. There's a place for that. But no, there's a strong tradition of civil libertarianism on the left, which I proudly identify with.
So let me bring up the part that I think confuses most people, and I think you would disagree with this. Most people see things like Medicare for all, or not even, I wouldn't go that far. Let's go less than that. Just government running medicine in general, not even Medicare for all. The current system where the government runs most of the medicine or has heavy control over most medicine in our country, particularly New York State. New York State, it almost runs everything. It's rare in New York State for unless it's non-essential, for the government to not be directly involved in everything you do medical. They see that as socialism. I think you see that still as capitalism, though, don't you?
Yeah, it's it's a system that relies on public-private partnership. Any public-private partnership is a capitalist system. It's not subject to any democratic control whatsoever in a meaningful way, I would argue. So yes, it's just a nonsense term that people throw around because Americans don't actually know the history of ideology. No refraction is that socialistic in any way, shape, or form. Government control does not equal socialism. That it is just
what equals socialism?
I would say socialism is some form of democratic control over major decisions in political, economic, social, and cultural life. That's how I define it.
So if instead of a hospital being run by the government or a hospital being run by a private corporation, if it was, say, a co-op hospital owned by the doctors and nurses, would that be socialism?
Somehow responsive to the needs of the community, run by both the workers and the community itself in a meaningful way where there's democratic exchange. Ideally, you would be able to network with other hospitals and you would be able to pool resources into large-scale investments in research and things along those lines. What we basically have now is the worst of both worlds. A government in hock to private corporations and private corporations that are basically motivated by profit to get Americans addicted to various drugs. It's the worst of it all.
100% agree. Yeah. But let me walk down this road, though. Sure. What if we had a situation where we had a hospital in a given area that was owned by the doctors and nurses and other medical staff that run the hospital, right? I don't know all people run it, but whatever, the medical staff that run it. And it was run by them. However, the local people still was a capitalist society. They paid a fee to get the services. Wouldn't that be a form of democracy in that I'm deciding with my dollars on, I want you to be able to fix my broken leg, or I want you to spend time on lazy eye surgery or something.
The problem is inherent in the idea of democracy is equality, and not everyone has the same amount of dollars to vote. So you're going to have what happens here, which is that certain people are going to have the equivalent of 1 million votes and certain people are going to have the equivalent of 1.
Yes. So how does one get around that? Because doesn't that happen no matter what? Isn't that part of all the systems that this?
So this is the human nature argument. So I think this is where libertarians go wrong philosophically. I've written a piece on Murray Rothbard. I read a lot of libertarians. Libertarians assume that that social hierarchy has to be represented in wealth, in differences in wealth. I could say what I basically believe is that societies are going to have hierarchies. That is a tendency of humanity, I would say.
Sure.
I don't love making human nature arguments, but I'll make one now for argument's sake.
I like it.
Those hierarchies don't necessarily have to be embodied in wealth. They could be embodied. They will be embodied in different forms. Some people will be more talented. People will be smarter. People will be considered better looking. People will be more charismatic. People will be more whatever, better X or Y. The problem with capitalism is that or libertarianism is that it assumes the necessity of hierarchy measured through wealth. That is not, to me, a historical necessity. Even if you admit that hierarchy is probably going to exist, hierarchy of some form in any society, that hierarchy doesn't have to be embodied through wealth.
What I would ask you then is there an example of any society to the top of the hierarchy wasn't wealthy?
Well, I would say we haven't been around that long. Let's not give up the ghost quite yet. Especially we haven't had industrial capitalism for that long, which is really the world we're talking about.
I would say even prior to that, I feel like hierarchy has always manifested in wealth in some way, right? Even when we were just trading gold pieces, weren't the hierarchy, didn't they always become wealthy? Church even became wealthy, right? Even
so hierarchies, wealthy, right? Hierarchies have always been measured in access to resources, right? But as we've discussed, the major resource, food, is now basically free due to the Green Revolution. So I think we've actually escaped a form of Malthusian trap, but our brains and societies haven't yet caught up to that reality. Resources will always be expressed on hierarchical. It doesn't have to be expressed necessarily in wealth.
Well, what about the idea of like...
Missy Richmond doesn't like me. I'm sorry, Missy. I'm sorry. I'm so pompous and condescending.
Missy's mad at you.
I like you, Missy.
So I guess the other issue, though, is right. What if it was democratic, like the ancient Greeks, right? What if we got a
slavery, existed on a bedrock of slavery?
No, I meant the democracy part, not the slavery part.
Oh, really? But that's the problem, right?
I wanted to push the slavery part away. I wanted to deal with the democracy part.
You can't.
But what if we took that democracy part, no slavery part, we just did the democracy part, and we bring that here and we say, hey, we get to vote on whether you get to be rich. Daniel, You're a good guy, so you get to be in the hierarchy because we voted you as our leader, however our leader is in a hierarchy. You get to be wealthy because you're the leader now. But if we vote on you next month, you're no longer the leader and you can't have the money anymore. Is that a more socialistic, acceptable environment?
I'm not a philosopher. I don't really like getting into these sorts of like first principle games, because if we actually had something like that, I always come when people talk about like having a new constitution, right? People
Sure.
talk about that. Let's bring it to that.
Yep.
It would be a constitution sponsored by Monsanto. So I think this is the problem, right? When you actually go into reality, you're not going to get any of these things again, because I think we lost. I think there was a moment in history where the workers could have seized the means of production, and that moment doesn't exist anymore, and we're basically fucked.
But then if we're going to federalism, which I think is amazing, Craig's on my side with federalism. He's like, federalism is the answer. Let all the states compete. I'd go even lower than that, Craig. I'll take states. I would take cities. I would take towns. I'd go even lower, but I would take states. I'm with you, Craig, on this one. If we go low enough, don't we have opportunity to show someone how it can be done and to have others eventually move through? Isn't that something? This is
always the utopian fantasy. You have the kibbutz, or you have
there we go, the kibbutz. Yes, perfect example.
You have the Peter Thiel Island Nation or whatever.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
I don't think it's going to be very successful. These sorts of prefigurative communities always fail because they always exist in capitalism. Basically the proverbial Benedict options, they'll always fail because there's one huge powerful structure and there's one group of utopians who after a few years will give up, as always happens.
So you think that even if we go to federalism and we start having states competing and or in my world, cities and towns and such, that even if there is a town that has done it right, they brought the good parts of the Greek democracy and left the slavery part, right? They do it. They actually do the thing that I say. And even if they become successful, other people won't go, hey, let's copy that. They'll go, no, or why wouldn't they?
I just don't think that's how the world exists. I don't think that would be a means to break through capitalism.
So there's no way to break through capitalism. We're all screwed.
I think, okay, so a point I started before saying earlier, and I never got into it. Okay. Marx basically worried that we would become alienated from capitalism, that capitalism would control us and we wouldn't control it. I think that is the world we live in. That's, I was saying before, Skynet has become self-aware. The algorithm is now conscious. I think it's very unlikely we're going to control it. That's where I am now.
Well, the part that I really am on total board with you on this one is I do think the system works on its own, right? I don't think anyone's even in control of the system. I think it's just going on its own. It runs because it runs because it runs.
Right. That's total alienation, by the way. That's like a nightmare, I would say. That's nightmarish.
And I think we're there. I agree with you. I think we are there. I've watched the system. I consult on criminal cases. I consult with individuals who are dealing with issues against the government, and I see it constantly. The system just moves forward. I look at our court system as just one massive meat grinder that shoves human beings in it and crushes them on a daily basis and doesn't care at all. It's a machine. It doesn't care at all.
Yes,
and I feel like our wars do that too.
Yeah.
Our government does that.
We're boned.
I do see that completely. Yeah. So on that note, I know we're doing such a wonderful, awesome, upbeat show. Please click that like button if you would, and let me know how awesome this is. I do appreciate it. I got to get past the system. Look, it's Skynet, so let's get around it by scamming with the like button. Let's do that. So, and also, if you're watching this on Twitter, please retweet this. We want to make sure that more people can see this. And of course, also, if you want to get your comment to the front, super chat me on YouTube if you want to. All good. Can I grab a couple of comments if you don't mind? Daniel, did I lose you? I hope I didn't lose him for the comments.
I'm back. I'm back. So Larry, I've got about 10 more minutes.
Yep. So I'm going to grab just a couple of comments and I'll let you run. Is that okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Good. Pete says, my grandfather used to say, nothing in this life is free. You have to earn it. No work, no gain. Isn't that mindset a positive mindset to have, even though it may not be a socialist mindset? Isn't that a good mindset for everyone to have?
I just think it's bullshit in 2023.
Tell
It
me.
might have been true when his grandfather was speaking about 1950. Basically, from 1950 to 1975, there were genuine opportunities for social mobility. It hasn't been true for 50 years. I don't know what you want. That's just the facts.
So you think that people who are trying to earn things don't earn them? I don't understand what you're saying is different. That you
I think
can't
you could
earn
work.
anymore?
You could work a ton, and it doesn't matter. Think about people who work 2 jobs and they're still poor. That's what I think, and I think that's true for most people in this country.
Okay.
Everyone feels precarious.
Okay. I think they do feel that, but I do. Okay. Dustin says he read a study that estimated 700 million people would emigrate to the U.S. if we opened up our borders. And I think that's in response to the idea of people not thinking America is the
Again, I would rather be at the top of the capitalist heap than at the bottom. To me, that doesn't mean anything, really.
Got it. So you just think that it's just because their place is bad?
Yeah. Yeah. It's better to be the country that consumes whatever it is, 20% of the world's energy, than to be the country that has children work in Nike factories.
But the point you brought up earlier, though, was about the idea of if you're North African, you probably go to Europe, and if you're Mexican, you probably go to America. But I think if you look at immigration, North Africans come here too.
Sure, it would be a matter of numbers, and that has to do less with like desire and more to do with the. I've done some immigrant advocacy work. It has to do with like what's available to you. These aren't like free choices being made by people. It's absurd to think that.
Gotcha. Okay, I got you. Sam says, if it weren't for government grants and money, bribes and government officials and market interventions, could those mega corporations have created monopolies? I know in my business, I couldn't keep up. And this is a point that I bring up. Is it inherent that there will be monopolies, or can you have a government that will break monopolies? And I feel like, to your point of the 50s through 70s, I think there was a time when this country's government did spend more time breaking up monopolies than it does now. Now it basically just encourages monopolies. Am I wrong with that?
Really, in the 20s and the 30s, again, a moment very much unlike our own, a moment when the masses seem to have political influence that they don't have now. We just don't live in that world anymore. People need to be more historical in their thinking. You know, what actually are the conditions of 2023 America? Just because something happened in 1925 America, it doesn't mean it's irrelevant to today.
So you're saying that unless we change a system to where there is more democracy in our system in general, we're not going to be able to go back to a world where the government does what we want to do. And you believe that people right now are too busy watching porn and taking drugs, that there are not enough of them to go off and make that
I
happen.
also think even if they weren't doing that, the state is like super powerful, and the military. I mean, this is Max Weber. What is this nation state? It holds the monopoly of legitimate force. There's no force able to challenge these things. It's a fantasy, literally a fantasy that people get on the liberal side of the equation. They talk about fascism. On the right side, they talk about civil war. It's all fantasy nonsense. Everyone's just disempowered.
But what about the argument they'll give you, right? Is, look, Daniel, you say we're so powerful. The Afghanis, they beat us. The Vietnamese, they beat us. Why can't we just go into the mountains and we could beat them just like the Vietnamese or Afghanis?
I mean, how has your life been affected by the 20-year Afghanistan war? No, that shows how powerful we are.
A little bit, but no, just I know.
Maybe you personally, but
yes.
The average American, no. That's the evidence of power. We could go around fucking up countries around the world, and it doesn't affect your life in a direct way whatsoever. That's the ultimate measure of power.
I've always said that, right? Empires can lose wars left and right. Countries can't, but empires can. Empires lose wars all the time. Countries can't, but empires do. And we haven't won a war since 1945. So we
haven't declared a war since 1942.
Absolutely. So most people don't know that the last time, for those of you who are listening, the last time U.S. declared war was on Germany's allies of Bulgaria.
Romania, Bulgaria, and there's a third one. I forget which.
Hungary.
Hungary. Yep, there we go.
Yes. The interesting piece is we did not declare war on Finland, which was also a Nazi ally. We did not declare war on them. So a little interesting historical tidbit. We kind of somehow ignored the Finns. Maybe because they were fighting Russians. I don't know, but whatever. So yes, they actually were there. Patty actually agrees with you. Patty is on your side. She's like,
Patty sounds like a genius.
There we go. She's like, I think he's right. If I could find her comment, but she actually posted that she thinks you're right, that she feels like you're saying what she's been thinking about for a long time. Here, Patty says, I sadly agree with your guest, Larry. I think we as a species have lost. So you've got some fans. You may have, maybe Missy's mad at you, but Patty's on your side. So maybe that's one-on-one.
Patty and Missy should both subscribe to my podcast, American Prestige, if they want more hot takes like this. See, I'm a good little entrepreneur too.
There
We're all capitalist subjects.
Capitalize all day, brother. I'm in. Christopher says he is correct. The non-commercial music scene is alive. Oh, incorrect. The non-commercial music scene is alive and we're creating wealth online.
No, the fact is the music industry has contracted. I don't know what to tell him. He's wrong. The music industry has significantly contracted over the past 40 years. This has been proven again and again and again. At least in terms of distributional wealth. Maybe certain companies like Spotify have become insanely wealthy, but in terms of distribution of wealth across the spectrum, it's not even arguable.
Gotcha. Natalie says you need totalitarianism to force change. So she, I think, is saying that we need...
She wants a dictatorship of the proletariat. She wants Lenin.
Maybe that's what she wants. Dictatorship to beat dictatorship.
Yeah. That's
right. But I think what many Americans actually do want, not me, but I think many Americans do want a benevolent dictatorship. I think many Americans actually want that. If they could pick their king, I bet many Americans would pick their king. Do you think I'm wrong on that?
Hey, Larry, could you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. Yep.
Okay, sorry. That Americans want dictatorship. I think Americans just want things to get better. I don't think they're thinking in those political theory terms. They want to pay less for housing. They want to pay less for cars. They want to, eat good food, raise their families. I don't think most Americans are concerned with this stuff. Why would you be?
Roy loves your narcotized. He calls you brilliant. So you've got some fans
Roy.
here.
Roy, you got to subscribe to American Prestige, man. Put your money where your mouth is, like a libertarian.
There we go. See that?
Vote with your dollars.
That's what I'm saying. See, we're on the same page, man. I don't know if I'm turning you more, you're turning me. I'm not sure. I may be turning you more than you're turning me. I'm not sure. So we'll see how that works. So yes, let me grab one or two more of these.
Yeah, one or two more. I got to get going. Sorry.
Carl says, that guy is crazy. LOL. Private-public partnership is not socialism. Who is paying the private company for the service the government hired the company to do? The public.
I'm a little confused by the comment.
I'm actually confused also. I'm not sure.
I think Carl meant to say something else. But Carl, if you want to really prove me wrong, subscribe to American Prestige.
Well, there we go. I think he's got you on that one. So yes, we could do that. But Gene brings up my big point, which is government is monopoly. That is always
the difference is it's monopoly theoretically controlled by the citizenry. It's a huge difference.
Yes, and I go back to the same thing. If we don't have an actual democracy and the people actually have power, I think you're right. We're in trouble.
And that's what we got because of capitalism.
Oh, come on now. You had to add that in at the end. No, it's because of big government. That's what it is, because we kept going for big government. That's the real reason.
Well, agree to disagree.
There we go. Guys, I want to say, if you like this show, then please click that like button. It really does matter. And you know what? Daniel was so good to come on this Libertarian podcast and be honest and full with us. And he showed us some love. So show him some love. Follow him at AmericanPrestigePod.com and also on Twitter.
And we're also on Substack. So American Prestige is a podcast. We have awesome things. Check us out. And Larry, I just want to say thank you so much for having me on. It was a real pleasure.
I appreciate it. Guys, thank you all so much. I will see you.